I am going to do the open.
Oh, good morning. Can you all hear me? Good morning. A very warm welcome to all of you. Don't be shy if there's reserved seats. Sorry, so I was going to say, please move to the front. It's really good to welcome all of you here today to our annual EU-China Forum. It takes place at a very particular time. Obviously there are a number of reasons why it's quite timely and potentially controversial. But the reason when we were thinking about this forum a year ago was that next year represents 50 years of the kind of EU-China diplomacy framework. And both EU and China have had a framework of, let's say, principles or values underpinning their respective diplomacy. And I suppose what we want to do here today is to think about and work through how do we need to reset, rethink, improve, develop EU-China relations in the context of hopefully a mutual framework of cooperation and collaboration. What does that take given the world we find ourselves in at the moment and given the changing nature currently of global relations? But more of that in a moment. My name is Dharmendra Kanani. I'm Chief Operating Officer and Chief Spokesperson. I'll have the pleasure of moderating this two-session summit with you, hopefully all throughout the day. Just a few points of admin. You've got the headsets because this forum is being simultaneously translated. So we have English and Mandarin. So those of you who need it, please feel free to make sure you make use of the headsets. If you have any questions, obviously those of you online, welcome and good to see you. At least know that you are present and participating. And if there are questions, please do raise your hands, or I will pick on you regardless. We have obviously a very full and busy agenda. We have a number of speakers from both across Europe, but also from China. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome the delegation from Beijing that's arrived yesterday. So thank you for making the time to be with us and to give us a very specific, let's say, focus and interpretation of how you see EU-China relations. But it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and thank you for making the effort to be with us. Okay, so we have a number of speakers lined up, quite a few online for this opening session, and we're going to open this first session about dialogue and cooperation with two significant ambassadors. We have the new ambassador to the EU from China, who's going to be joining us, and it's great to have you. I'll welcome you in a moment. But we also have Jorge Toledo, who is the EU's ambassador to China online, and both gentlemen will be able to share their perspectives on EU-China relations. But a word, I suppose, of let's look at some of the data here. Globally, China accounts for over 80% of solar cell exports, over 90% of lithium-ion batteries, and over 20% of electric cars. So that's China's export weight. Over 90% of solar panels deployed in the EU are imported from China. And whilst the EU has enacted various regulations like the AI Act, China has developed its own governance around AI and so on. The other important thing to remember is between 2017 and 2022, Chinese investors participated in 98 funding rounds involving European AI companies, contributing an estimated 1.4 billion, while European investors were involved in transactions raising 11.2 billion for China's AI sector. So, putting aside the trade as well. So, both EU and China are its respective large one of the largest trading partners outside of, let's say, the US. So there's a long trading, economic development trajectory and relationship. We know that in the heady years of the initiation of globalization, EU benefited greatly, as did China. And, made in China became a global brand. As we all know that. There isn't a household without something that's made in China. But now the world has changed, as we know. And we have other economies that are providing competition, but also value and a manufacturing base that is potentially outstripping China's prowess. Look at India. Look at what's happening in the broader Pan-Asian Pacific. Let's look at the fact that India was middle class with the largest in the world, and its economic prowess is just growing. And so, what does that mean for EU-China relations? Also, we know that in Africa, many states are growing at an exponential rate. Nigeria will be the most populous nation in the world in less than 10 years. What does that mean for EU-China relations and more broadly global relations? And I suppose lastly, we thought the world could not get any worse after the fact that we have a war in Ukraine. We have a major situation and a potential war, broadening across the Middle East. And then Mr. Trump gets elected to the US. So there we go. If we wanted anything further to complicate our lives, we have it. So what does that mean in broader terms for EU-China relations? So it gives me a great pleasure, Ambassador Cai, to thank you for joining us. I know that this is one of your first gigs in this kind of forum, and you are the new ambassador to the EU. So please, I warmly welcome you to the stage. Thank you very much. Sorry, that's okay. Thank you.
Ambassador Jorge Toledo, Ambassador Chen Yuming, Ambassador Tang Heng, distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today, I'm very delighted to get together with both old and new friends at the 12th China-Europe Forum. Since its inception in 2011, the China-Europe Forum has provided a valuable platform and played a positive role in advancing dialogue, mutual understanding, and cooperation among insightful minds from all sectors. This year's forum, themed on the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic relations, is highly relevant as it allows us to reflect on the past and look forward to the future. On behalf of the Chinese mission to the European Union, let me first congratulate on this year's forum and warmly welcome all distinguished guests being here today. I also wish to express my sincere gratitude to Friends of Europe, the China Public Diplomacy Association, and all those who have long supported and contributed to China-EU relations. In 1975, the older generations of Chinese and European leaders showed extraordinary political foresight and courage, breaking down the barriers of Cold War to decide to establish diplomatic ties. Over the past half-century, China-EU relations have weathered international changes, maintaining a momentum of steady growth and becoming increasingly strategically and globally significant. The past 50 years has witnessed the continuous elevation of China-EU relations. Since the establishment of diplomatic ties, the relationship has reached new heights through joint efforts. In 2001, we established a comprehensive partnership. which was upgraded to Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2003. In 2014, President Xi Jinping made a historic visit to the EU headquarters, during which he called for joint efforts to build 4 bridges for peace, growth, reform, and civilization, so that the China-EU Comprehensive Strategic Partnership will take on even greater global significance. The China-EU Summit since 1998 has taken place 24 times. The leadership exchange is also complemented by high-level dialogues in strategic, economic, digital, environmental, and people-to-people fields, as well as over 70 consultation and dialogue mechanisms. The fact that this year President Xi Jinping visited 3 European countries and leaders from 10 European nations visited China fully reflects the strong momentum and broad prospects of China-EU relations. The past 50 years has witnessed the flourishing of practical cooperation. China and the EU are now each other's major trading partners and investment destinations. According to Chinese statistics, our bilateral trade volume reached $783 billion in 2023, with cumulative mutual investments exceeding $250 billion. The China-Europe freight train service operated 100,000 trips. Our cooperation on geographical indications realized mutual recognition and protection of 100 GI products on each side. And we successfully completed the public announcement of the second round of 170 GI products on each side. The two sides also achieved fruitful cooperation in the fields of finance, environmental protection, transportation, science and technology, education, customs, health and justice, and made steady progress in cooperation in emerging sectors such as digital economy, new energy, and AI. We also organized events like the China-EU Cultural Year and Tourism Year. Recently, China unilaterally offered visa-free access to nearly 20 EU countries, a move that will further facilitate people-to-people exchanges. The past 50 years has witnessed the joint contributions to global peace and stability and development. China and the EU are two major forces advancing multipolarity, two large markets supporting globalization, and two great civilizations advocating for diversity. A robust China-EU relationship benefits not only our two peoples, but also global peace, stability, and prosperity. As advocates of multilateralism, we work closely at the UN, G20, and other platforms, and maintain communication on major international and regional issues, including the Ukraine crisis, the Palestine-Israel conflict, and the Iran nuclear issue. We both support the WTO's central role in the multilateral trading system and stay committed to advancing WTO reform. By promoting the conclusion and implementation of the Paris Agreement, we're taking concrete actions to address climate change and other global challenges to safeguard our shared planet. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the country has embarked on a new journey of building a great country and advancing national rejuvenation on all fronts through Chinese modernization. China's development and growth will bring more opportunities to Europe and the world at large. First, China's further reform and opening up will bring opportunities. This July, the Chinese Communist Party held the third plenary session of the 20th CPC Central Committee, making systematic plans for further comprehensively deepening reform and advancing Chinese modernization. The meeting outlined over 300 significant reform measures to be implemented within the next 5 years. These include fully removing foreign investment restrictions in manufacturing, further opening sectors like biotechnology, cloud computing, value-added telecommunications, and wholly foreign-owned hospitals, and steadily expanding institutional openness. China's door of opening up will only open wider. Second, China's high-quality development will bring opportunities. China's economy boasts broad markets, strong resilience, immense potential, and a comprehensive industrial system. China is advancing high-quality development and accelerating the growth of new productive forces. In the first half of this year, investment in high-tech manufacturing and service industries both grew by double digits. The country's economic structure and growth model continue to be optimized. Over the years, China has contributed more than 30% of global economic growth and remains a key trading partner for over 140 countries and regions. With the recent policy measures, Chinese economy will continue to move upward, and we have full confidence in achieving this year's economic growth target. China will continue to serve as a major engine of global growth. Third, China's peaceful development will bring opportunities. In pursuit of Chinese modernization, China neither follows the old path of colonial exploitation nor pursues a hegemonic path of power dominance. Instead, we keep to a just cause of peaceful development. China adheres to an independent foreign policy of peace, advocating for an equitable and orderly multipolar world and inclusive, mutually beneficial economic globalization. We're committed to working with all nations to implement the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiatives, as well as advance high-quality Belt and Road Initiative. The aim is to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, next year marks the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic relations. Despite some of the challenges, this relationship faces significant opportunities. At this crucial moment, it is important that we work together to seize opportunities, address challenges, and promote the healthy and stable development of China-EU relations. To this end, I would like to share my views on 3 aspects. First, China and the EU should be partners, not rivals. There are no fundamental conflicts of interest between the two sides. In fact, we have more areas of consensus and cooperation than differences and competition. We're partners rather than rivals. China always views relations with the EU from a strategic and long-term perspective. Regarding Europe as an important direction in China's diplomacy and an important partner in pursuit of Chinese modernization. Similarly, We hope that the EU side can take an objective and rational view of China's development and think about the future direction of China-EU relations. We believe that differences in social system, ideology, history, culture, and level of development should serve as a driving force for dialogue and cooperation, not as reasons or excuses for rivalry or confrontation. As partners, we should respect each other's core interests and major concerns. This is a valuable lesson we learned from the past 50-year relationship. China hopes to work with the EU to reaffirm partnership and make good preparations for the next China-EU summit on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic ties. We hope to deepen strategic communication and build mutual trust to ensure the steady and sustained growth of China-EU relations. Second, China and the EU should strengthen practical cooperation, not seek decoupling. The essence of our practical cooperation in trade and other fields lies in complementary advantages and mutual benefit. The past 50 years has shown that we're deeply intertwined and have a stake in each other's success. We hope to consolidate and expand practical cooperation in various fields and turn each other into key partners for business cooperation, priority partners for cooperation in science and technology, and trustworthy partners for cooperation in industrial and supply chains. At the same time, China opposes the politicization and securitization of trade issues and stands against protectionism. We hope to work with the EU in the same direction and implement the consensus reached by our leaders to resolve trade frictions through dialogue and consultation. Issues such as the ongoing electric vehicle case should be properly handled to preserve the broader framework of China-EU trade cooperation. People-to-people exchanges hold the key to sound state-to-state relations. We welcome more European friends to visit China for sightseeing and making investments. We also hope the EU provide greater convenience for Chinese citizens coming to Europe. Third, China and the EU should add more stability and certainty to the world, not complexity. The world is undergoing a new period of turbulence and transformation. China supports European integration and strategic autonomy, as well as a greater role in international affairs. Both China and the EU support multipolarity, uphold international laws and basic norms of international relations, and oppose a new Cold War and bloc confrontation. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the UN next year, China is ready to work with the EU and the wider global community to uphold the UN-centered international system and promote a just and equitable international order. As two global players, China and the EU share the responsibility to add greater stability and certainty to this turbulent world. To drive global growth in development and provide more leadership and support to global governance. Together, we should continue to make new contributions to global peace and development. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Chinese people often say that at 50, one knows the mandate of heaven. We also believe that where there's a will, there's a way. As we approach the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic ties, I very much look forward to hearing your insights and suggestions. Let us work together to usher in a brighter future for China-EU relations. Finally, I wish this year's China-Europe Forum a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well received, and I'm sure in the context of the kind of diplomatic efforts we need, it's important that the dialogue is both open and frank, with a sense of common endeavour for creating both peace, stability and economic development over time. So thank you for that. Thank you for your commentary. I'd like now to invite Ambassador Jorge Toledo, who is the EU's ambassador to China. Thank you. He can't be here in person, obviously, because he's based over in China. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Jorge, to the virtual platform.
Good morning, good afternoon in Beijing. Ni hao. Ambassador Cai Run, my friend, dear friends from China and dear friends of Europe. It is my great pleasure to attend today's conference organized by the Friends of Europe. It's my second time attending your event as the European Union ambassador to China. I have been here for a bit over 2 years. This conference is of particular importance as it refers to the upcoming 50th anniversary of the EU-China relations, which we will commemorate next year. In the past 5 decades, the EU and China relationship has followed the unprecedented development and growth of China. It has reached a level which is, I would say, has made China one of the main, the China-EU relationship, one of the most important relationships of the EU. I will dwell a little bit on that, and I'm afraid I will be a bit less optimistic than my friend Cai Run, because after 50 years of extremely intense relationship, we have reached a moment where there are challenges to our relationship. So I hope we will use the 50th anniversary to rebuild the trust and the intense relationship we have had for the last 50 years. I just heard Ambassador Cai Run saying things that I hear here very often, like we are not rivals, we are just partners. Well, as I always say here also when I hear this kind of thing, I say that, as you know, since 2019, we have a new description of the China-EU relationship, which is three-faceted. And I always say this is not a strategy, this is a description. And I think it is a description. We are partners, yes. We are competitors. And when we say competitors, we don't mean the American way. And we are systemic rivals. And I must say, and this is why I say our relationship is now more challenging. Unfortunately, the dominant feature of the relationship is now more about competition and systemic rivalry than it has been in the last 50 years. We are partners. Oh, yes, we are partners. And the most important example of our partnership is fight against climate change, protection of biodiversity, and protection of the environment. We have an excellent dialogue with our Chinese friends in all these extremely important global challenges. We also have our differences. We would like China to be more ambitious. We would like China to fight more ambitiously and start really fighting against methane emissions. And we would like, and this is the subject of a very intense discussion right now in Baku, we would like China to contribute to climate financing of developing countries. I know that the Paris Accord prescribes common but differentiated contributions or responsibilities. But China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. 30% of greenhouse gases are emitted by China. 2, China is a high middle income country, which in a couple of years will be a high income country. So if we talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, differentiated means that China should contribute not at the level of the European Union or the United States, but certainly more than least developed countries. And this is not happening now. So this is something that we are asking China in our very good partnership. Then we are competitors. And when I say we don't mean competitors in the American way. The American concept of competition is more about rivalry. When we say competitors, is that we compete in the global markets, both in trade and in investment. And this has been a very productive relationship in the last 50 years. And in the last 10, 20 years, it has been extremely productive, especially for China. Because, and this is why this is becoming challenging, because we have reached a level of unbalanced trade relationship, which is growingly unsustainable. In 2022, the China-EU trade relationship reached a Guinness Book of Record of trade imbalance or trade deficit in favor of China in the history. The European Union is the largest single market for China, for goods, but the relationship is growingly unbalanced. Even if in 23 the trade imbalance in value decreased a little bit, it grew, and it grew a lot in terms of volume. In 2022, when we reached this record trade deficit, for each container that China was sending to the EU, for each container that the EU was sending to China, China was sending 3.2 containers. All indications are that in 2024, for each container that the EU is sending to China this year, China is sending 4 containers. So China is exporting to the EU 4 times more than the EU is exporting to China. And of course, we know that the Chinese products are extremely good quality and very good price. but it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because we firmly believe, that we are not competing in a level playing field. We have been talking and we have been using dialogue with China, very intense dialogue. Last year, we had more than over 10 commissioners, vice presidents of the commission coming. We held the high economic and trade dialogue, which, by the way, we already had it this year again in Brussels. And I must say, and I must be very frank, with almost no progress. And we have a lot of issues. The European Union Chamber of Commerce in 2022 listed 947 market access barriers in China. Well, even after all these dialogues, now this year, the position paper of the European Union Chamber of Commerce showed over 1,000 trade market access barriers. And I have witnessed all these negotiations, all the discussions where we are not making progress. So this is no longer sustainable. And when the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council were here last year for the summit, they made it very clear that China has to open up, or we will have to take measures. And this is what is happening right now. We need China to walk the talk. We need China to really open up to our companies. We are receiving increasing complaints of our companies of new issues like criteria for localization of components and other issues that are even making the level playing field less balanced. I give you one example, not one example. I give you one data which shows how this relationship, even if it is of a great importance for China and for the European Union, has become or is becoming unsustainably unbalanced. From 2017 to 2024, China's GDP has grown by 40%. The European Union exports to China in the same period have gone down by 40%. So we are at a crossroad when it comes to our trade and economic relations. And we are asking from China to really walk the talk, to really open up, and to really make it a level playing field for our companies in China. And finally, we are rivals. And this is a description, because how can anybody say that we are partners when it comes to, for instance, the Russian aggression on Ukraine? I must say that I don't think the Chinese government has a good grasp of what this means for the European Union. A good grasp of how consequential, how existential this unprovoked and illegal aggression on Ukraine is for the European Union. And we cannot accept concept legitimate security concern. We cannot accept a reasoning by which the expansion of NATO would have created this problem. There are no legitimate security concerns that can justify this aggression. There is the expansion of NATO didn't create this problem. In fact, it was this problem, it was the Russian aggression on Ukraine which has caused the most important NATO expansion in the last 10 years, when Sweden and Finland changed completely their position on NATO, and their public opinion changed from 80% against joining NATO to 90% for joining NATO. This is how existential this is for the European Union. And we cannot understand how China who values so much territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs, cannot condemn this unprovoked and illegal aggression, which goes against the most basic principles of the UN Charter. The UN Charter, which was created, written, and agreed precisely to avoid this kind of aggressions. So, let me finish with some optimistic and
After all that, yes. Thank you, Jorge, as ever. So, obviously, Ambassador, like many of our key guests here are busy, so he'll be following the discussion as he goes on to other meetings whilst he's in Beijing. But thank you, Jorge, for your commentary. And as you say, I mean, you didn't pull any punches there. You were very direct and very clear. But the most important thing, as you concluded, was that if we are to make sense of this increasingly turbulent and unpredictable world, diplomacy counts. And so we do need to make sure that we're able to continue to have open channels of communication whilst they are also frank and able to move things forward. Because without that, we don't have much to rely on in terms of how the fate of humanity will be in the future if we're not able to continue dialogue. So I'm very pleased that we've had some very open and frank exchanges. I'm conscious of time, so I've literally got less than 45 minutes and I've got a whole panel of speakers. But I have agreed that we have we have a significant delegation from China that arrived yesterday. I am going to invite very briefly an ex-ambassador but vice president of the Chinese Association of Diplomacy to say a few words, if I may, but I would ask you to be very brief, please. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chen. Thank you.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to join the 12th China-EU Forum. On behalf of the China Public Diplomacy Association, I would like to express my gratitude for the kind invitation and to friends of Europe and the Chinese mission to the EU for their effort to making this forum a great success. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between China and the EU. Confucius said, at 40 years old, I freed myself out of perplexity, and at 50, I started to know and respond to the calling of the universe. So, what is the meaning of being free out of perplexity in terms of China-EU relations? It means we no longer compromise the principles of mutual respect and non-interference in each other's internal affairs, which are key points of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and have guaranteed nearly 80 years of world peace and stability since World War II. It means we no longer deviate from globalization, free trade, equality, mutual benefit, and fair competition, which have created decades of prosperity and development to both China and the EU, as well as the rest of the world. It means we no longer rewrite the outdated prescriptions like bloc politics, iron curtains, and the bigger lie neighbor policy, which have brought conflicts and wars rather than security and safety. Then, what does it mean to know and to respond to the calling of the universe? Teeming with natural disaster like disease outbreaks, environmental degradation, and human crises like economic downturns, deficit of trust, communication regresses, and frequent wars. The world is calling for peace, stability, safety, progress, and cooperation, reflecting the mainstream public opinion over the world. Knowing and responding to the calling of the universe means to catch up with such a surging world trend. What is needed for both of us to adhere to the mutual respect, trust, and equality, which are the guiding principles for the China-EU relations, and to seek common ground while resolving differences in aim to reach mutual benefit and win-win result. It requires the courage, strategic vision, and political wisdom to enhance understanding and trust through political dialogue and people-to-people exchanges, transcend ideological and institutional differences, and demonstrate political inclusiveness. Seeking a one-side victory is tempting, but is doomed to be short-lived. Knowing and responding to the calling of the universe means to adhere to multilateralism, oppose a new Cold War, promote coordination among powers, respect the independence in development of all countries and their security concerns, address global challenges jointly, handle differences properly, give and take in fair competition, promote industrial upgrading and advancement of newly emerged industries, together by taking advantages in market, technology, and capital, facilitate exchanges among personnel, including those engaged with culture, education, science and technology, media, and think tanks. Differences are inevitable, but conflicts are reversible. I hope that the policymakers from both China and the EU will be free out of perplexity, knowing and responding to the calling of the universe by bridging gaps and fences, embracing cooperation and working together to bring long-term stability and the well-being of the peoples of both China and the EU. I wish the 12th China-EU Forum a complete success. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Chen. That's very helpful, and I particularly like your invocation of the universe because I think we all need a bit of a good universal universe and healing of our world, given where we find ourselves. You know, what's really very clear is that our context demands dialogue and demands the ability to make compromise and move forward together. Given the fact that we are witnessing a world that we have not witnessed in the way that it is unfolding before our eyes, is the most, as security chiefs across the world have described, we are in the most precarious, unstable, and insecure world that we've ever been in since the Second World War. And that's quite a significant statement. So that requires us all to have a sense of responsibility, to focus on where we can find common endeavor and common good. So I'm really pleased that, or I hope that we are able to move in the right direction. But, you know, whoever said that diplomacy was easy? It's always been difficult. But as long as it's there and it's being marshaled and with a sense of, let's say, trying to find common endeavor, then we'll make progress. I'm running out of time already, and we've only had 3 speakers. So I know that I'm going to change the order somewhat because I know that one of our colleagues who's online has to leave well before 11. So can I invite our other speakers to come to the podium? Tang, Alicia. Please. Okay, I'm going to start with Thomas. Thank you for joining us, one of our European young leaders, but also you've been former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Czechoslovakia. So I want to start with you, if I may. You have been to the forum before, so I'm really grateful that you're joining us again, Thomas. And what I wanted to hear from you really is, given that we've had the Draghi report and competition seems to be the mantra of the day across the EU, given that that's the kind of appears to be the strategic direction, at least in terms of policy-making terms, to improve the EU's competitiveness, what do you see as the role of member states and the EU more broadly in the positioning of its relationship with China? Thomas, over to you.
Good morning to Brussels. It's always a pleasure, Anna, to see you. I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this very interesting debate. And I will happily follow to Ambassador Toledo's remarks, because I am convinced also that we are at a crossroad. We are at the very beginning of the new 5 years policy cycle in Europe, this new Parliament and Commission. And as you rightly mentioned, competitiveness and a strategic outlook will be what will guide decisions, discussions, policy making, both in Brussels but also in European capitals. I think that there will be a push for competitiveness, as Draghi's report mentioned, but also previously, and it was report mentioned, to focus on single market and how it works, both internally, but also with reactions and in relations to our partners' markets. Here, I believe that what we will see also is that EU will see relations with key partners, including China, increasingly through long-term strategic and geostrategic perspective. Here, I think we can learn from each other. You mentioned that China also see relations with EU through strategic lenses. EU will certainly be also advocating for, at the same time, respect for the true diversity in the new multipolar world, where security, protection of commons, and peace will be central. But at the same time, certainly something what the European capitals would like to discuss. And it has been mentioned that we need partnership, but at the same time, I think we need to respect that EU should react to the world, changing world as well. And in some regards, I believe that EU is just adjusting to what our partners, including China, are doing. If we're speaking about the risking, it is something China has been doing for many decades. We are speaking about protecting our jobs and our markets. It is the fact that EU is still the most open economy in the world, open for trade, open for investment. We see certainly that other key economies are much more closed, much more protected, and much more hostile to our investments. And it is the case of China as well. Let me very briefly, because I know that we are running out of time, but let me also briefly stop at two issues. I think that if EU and EU-China relations are going to overcome the current, and I'm afraid I'm hearing echo again.
Can I go carry on?
Is it working?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think that there will be more accent on the EU side for mutual responsibility for common goods, for commons, for solving those problems. One of the flagships of EU-China partnership and dialogue was a climate diplomacy, climate issue. And here I believe that we should be probably more honest to each other. Ambassador Toledo already mentioned, we are also expecting more from China on climate change mitigation, but also on taxation. We are just at the very most end of very sensitive discussions in Baku, in Azerbaijan, at COP29 about financing for climate. And here, let me just only add, EU is now, from the perspective of historical CO2 emissions, less responsible for global warming than China. China's global historical emissions are 312 gigatons of CO2, while EU's 303. So I think that it is time also to be open and honest, and not that the historical argument for who is responsible is that West or EU should pay. I think now is China also to pay for helping less developed countries to mitigate, but especially to adapt. And we don't see much. And I don't think that voluntary contribution is something where this responsibility for common problems and solving them is something we can as EU accept. And not to mention that if we are speaking about climate change, it is difficult to speak about climate change with a partner who supports somebody who is responsible for 1/4 of global increase in emissions just because he launched a war. Just let me stress, war in Ukraine increased global emissions by 1/4. Or is responsible for 1/4 of global increase of emissions. Out of 400 million tons, that is the annual increase, the war in Ukraine was responsible for some 85 million tons. The second area, I think, and I believe this is an opportunity, is what is the recent initiative of President Lula at the G20 meeting. And I think this is an area where I still hope for possibility for dialogue, and it is how to tackle the issue of global poverty and hunger. I think that the initiative of President Lula is something where we can maybe start discussing with key partners, including China. And let me conclude on a positive way. I think that there are areas where capitals in Europe will be interested in discussing with China, especially when we speak about climate change. issues like technological transfers to developing countries that can help mitigate climate change and adapt to climate change. Standards for exploration and extraction of key minerals, security of supply chains, and also, as I said, climate financing. These are areas I think where we need dialogue, and where I hope that in the next 5 years we can see a positive result, which will only confirm our mutual commitment to solving global problems. And thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm very much sorry for not being able to stay, but I need to connect to another conference at 11 straight.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thomas, as ever, thank you very much. It's much appreciated that, again, much like many of our contributors, you've been frank about the challenges. And also you've repeated some of the kind of issues that we live. I mean, you're reinforcing the fact that we live in a very different world than we were 50 years ago, and also China's rise as a really effective economy means that what it pays back in terms of what happens in relation to climate change has to fundamentally be reevaluated, because it's no longer a developing country, and therefore its contributions should be different. And the issue of Ukraine is not going to go away, colleagues. I think we need to be clear about that. That'll be running through the course of this debate. And I think we all need to be clear that we cannot have let's say, a country illegally invade another and blame expansionism as the basis of it. This is an issue of human rights. This is an issue of international law. And so if we're going to make this work, we need to deal with the elephant in the room, which is Ukraine. And I hope that we're able to move forward in a frank and effective manner in that regard. So thank you, Thomas, for making the comments you do. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to go to the ambassador from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tang. Thank you for joining us here. You've got a lot of experience in the diplomatic field. Tensions are high, as you can tell, not only in the comments that we've heard today, but globally about the relationships between EU and China. As opposed to thinking about what doesn't work, can I ask you to think about where do you think are the points of commonality that might move us forward?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Very happy to participate in today's forum. So in the current situation, to be able to organize this forum, this shows a warm spirit in this cold winter. Just like Ambassador Cai mentioned in his opening speech, the policies have been clarified, and the insights and the view on the Sino-China relationship has also been explained to the details. So I won't dwell on that. What I like to emphasize is that in the current world situation, where we see intensive geopolitical tensions, Europe and China, as two major powerhouses in the world, as two big markets, biggest markets, as two biggest civilizations in the world, we are responsible, we're also capable to join hands and move forward to contribute to the world's peace, development, and prosperity. So in the past 50 years, so tomorrow we are celebrating the 50 years anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between two sides. So for the past 5 decades, with joint efforts, both sides have shaped a close dependence on each other. So both sides have benefited a lot from this relationship. We will look at some statistics. In 2023, trade between two sides has amounted to $800 billion. The investment from China into Europe has also exceeded $100 billion and created 270,000 direct job opportunities. So we benefit a lot from this relationship. Many European enterprises and entrepreneurs and partners have played its part in the modernization of China, and also they've gained in the Chinese market. The facts don't lie. So this codependence is not risky. It's not a risk. And our codependence in terms of interests does not equal insecurity. So in the future, we need to seek more common grounds and opportunities for collaboration. With better political intention, as well as the will and the passion to co-develop this relationship, we could do more. And also, Mr. Toledo mentioned the issue of imbalance of the trade. Here are my thoughts. So in terms of the trade deficit, or imbalance, as we call it, there are many factors in terms of the macroeconomic environment, in terms of our industrial structure, and also including the different needs and the change of needs of two different markets, as well as the different stages of development of China and Europe. This all lead to this trade deficit or imbalance. What I want to emphasize is that we're not seeking the trade deficit. In 2023, the deficit has declined 26.7%. In terms of market access, we strike great efforts. We are issuing more opening up policies and measures. In 2024, the negative list has declined from 93 in 2017 to 29. And for manufacturing industry, the market access has reached to 0. So there is no more limitation in manufacturing market access. And we are, in the meantime, granting more preferential treatment. And as you may know, each year we're hosting the Import Expo. So this is the only major economy in the world that hosts an import-focused expo. So this is also beneficial, or provides a platform for foreign goods to come to the Chinese market, and many enterprises are present. Also, one of our concerns is that up until now, in terms of high-tech products, EU has limitations in export to China. So we hope to see the easing and less limitations. We cannot complain the imbalance in trade, but also in the meantime, we limit the export of high-tech products to China. This is unreasonable, and this is not equal. We've also noticed that for the Russian-Ukraine war has a huge impact in the EU-China relation. But what I want to say here is that we say in China, we need to find the root cause of the matter. China is not engaged in this war. China has not caused this war. So at the very beginning, we have announced that we should respect the sovereign country. We should respect the UN Charter. All the efforts should be supported. All the reasonable concerns in terms of security should be guaranteed from all countries. So everything has a cause and consequence. As you have said, yes, the expansion of NATO should not be a justifiable cause of the war. But for one country, for a region's security should not be built on the insecurity of another. An absolute security may cause your rival or the other side may push them to an extreme insecure matter or situation. So, on one side, we aim to push both sides to the table of talk and dialogue in terms of green economy, in terms of AI, and regarding the new energy, we have great space for collaboration in the future, including in the matter of war. We are seeking the international community's joint efforts for a peaceful solution. Thank you so much. That's all for my.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to switch things up a little bit because I know, Professor Wang, I was going to call you in next, but if you don't mind, I'm going to change the order. We've listened to too many men so far, and we need to move to listening to some of the women on the panel. So I prefer to do that now, please, and move to, firstly, Angeline, thank you for being with us, and E3G is also a knowledge partner to this forum, so I'm really pleased that we've been able to establish that relationship and partnership with yourselves. You're quite a well-known presence in the field of climate and climate action, and you have grown as a agency quite significantly. Angelina, tell us, share with us. You're a policy expert and advisor on EU-China relations related to climate. What's your take on where we go, given the air of tension? Let's say, or tension in the air that we're witnessing. What's your sense of where we might be able to move forward in a cooperative, collaborative manner?
Thank you very much, Dharmendra, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today as well, and for the good words on E3G. Thank you very much. We've heard already quite a lot about climate that was mentioned several times this morning, and indeed one of the first things that come to mind when we think about the EU-China cooperation is the climate cooperation. And intuitively that makes sense. Both the EU and China are among the two biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. They have also both experienced firsthand the dangers and the threat of climate change. And I think we cannot stress enough the urgency of climate action. So we need EU-China climate cooperation. That's a fact. However, the view that global climate cooperation is a sunny island in an increasingly dangerous water does not really reflect reality anymore. We've heard it from several intervenants this morning, but in recent years, the balance between cooperation and competition has a trend to shift towards more the competition side of the relationship, and then it's rather naive now to assume that cooperation on climate can be insulated from this broad trend that we are noticing. So my point is that we often hear the debate framed as either cooperate or compete with China. But I believe that in reality, both approaches are needed. Both approaches are essential when it comes to climate. Given the stakes, of course, cooperation is non-negotiable. China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, but it is also the largest investor in renewable energy sources. So China has an outsized role to play in the green transition. And the EU will need China for its green transition. The EU can also offer a significant market for the Chinese clean technology. So collaborative efforts are needed, especially around COP, and the technical partnerships as well are actually critical to tackle global warming. Over the years, we've noticed, we've already explored a number of potential avenues for cooperation with varying degrees of success, of course. But I am quite optimistic that we can continue to rely on these avenues for the future of the relationship, whether it is at the political or technical level, at the bilateral or the multilateral level, or even at the central and the subnational level. I can return to this topic a bit later, maybe expand a bit on the details of the cooperation side. But I'd like to actually use the time that I have left to also address the thorny issue of competition that we've heard risen several times this morning. Actually, I believe that competition too can be a strong driver for climate action, particularly in technology and in climate finance. Ideally, competition in this sphere could create a race to the top, encouraging both sides to decarbonize domestically, but also to decarbonize faster in third countries. But competition must remain constructive. It should not slip into an all-out rivalry when decisions center on competitiveness alone and actually sidelining the decarbonization efforts. So EU-China relationship might be increasingly complex, but I believe that where space for climate cooperation is closing, there is a space to advance through constructive climate competition. And I conclude by saying that the idea that climate collaboration exists in a silo, separate from other tensions, is actually misleading. Geopolitical challenges inevitably affect climate cooperation, and a realistic approach should consider the evolving balance between competition and cooperation. And our main goal at the end of the day should always to continue to be to pursue ambitious climate action in spite of these complicated geopolitical tensions that are arising worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for being brief, and I really appreciate the fact that you've brought, I suppose, a different aspect to the conversation that we need to have. And that's I suppose that's the beauty of you being an independent think tank of a varying nature. Before I move to Eugene and Wang, I want to open up to the floor very briefly because I'm conscious of the fact that you've been listening to people all this time, and we pride ourselves on making sure that it's not a one-way or two-way street here. This is about the collective intelligence in the room. So I really would like to give the opportunity for people to ask or make comment, but I need you to be very brief because I'm already really close to the closing time of this session. So if you want to, there should be mics on their way, please, colleagues. Lovely. So firstly, gentlemen here, I would ask you to introduce yourself and your very brief question.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Finbar Birmingham from the South China Morning Post. Question for the ambassador. I'd like to get your thoughts on the reports we see. You talk about the room for cooperation, but in Brussels, everybody's talking about the reports of a Chinese drone factory making drones for the Russian military. There are reports this week about a Chinese ship cutting cables in the Baltic Sea. So where do you sit on those issues? Can you give us some comment on those and how that fits into the narrative of cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman here. Again, do introduce yourself.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have a question for Angeline. I mean, since you're the only non-Chinese speaker at the moment, I mean, when you say about climate cooperation, I mean, sometimes people question how genuine EU is. There was a lot of talk about China should step up. I mean, definitely everyone should step up. But when China really stepped up, I mean, say in clean technologies, I mean, EU leaders from Ursula von der Leyen and others try to frame it as sort of ideological. We should not let China lead in this clean technology. It's a national security threat. So, I mean, we talk about solar, wind, and then now EV. And also, I mean, just very briefly, I have actually the question for Ambassador Toledo I don't get to ask. When he said about, EU doesn't compete with China, US style, actually, it's getting more like US style. If you look at how EU treat Huawei or how EU let US pressure ASML, in the Netherlands, or the many more investor screening mechanisms that obviously target Chinese companies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, can I ask you to respond to the question from the journalist?
谢谢你的问题。关于你提到的两个具体的事件
For the two instances, specific instances you actually referred to, I actually do not know about these specific events. But since this Russian-Ukraine conflict, China has not sold any weapon to either party of the war or of the conflict. And China, when exporting these dual-use items, has lots of restrictions for the export of dual use. For example, the civil use of drones. In China, we have very strict screening measures on such exports. So I would like to say that certain things, for example, between China and Russia, the trade has been maintained. However, it is maintained complying with the WTO rules and also complying with the market economy principles. There are more than 140 countries in the world who has maintained normal trade relations with Russia, including some European member states and the U.S. According to official statistics of 2023, EU-US trade volume with Russia account for 20% of the Russia's external trade. And first half of this year, EU has surpassed the US in terms of trade volumes, in terms of the trade with Russia. I would also like to say that China is also the biggest trading partner of Ukraine. With Ukraine, we have maintained a strategic partnership between China and Ukraine. So the Ukraine matter or the Russia-Ukraine conflict bundled together with the China and Russia relations, I don't see the sense of such a bundling, and it's not conducive for a peaceful solution of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Angeline.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for your question. I won't be able to answer for Ambassador Toledo,
no, of course not,
unfortunately. No. But just on your question, I think it is quite clear that climate is still a very strong priority for the EU. It has been repeated several times, even for the new mandate of the European Commission. And even though it's not the only priority at the moment, it is still very high on the agenda. We've also noticed last year a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions for the EU, which was quite significant. And the EU is also one of the first investor in green projects and in climate finance. So I would say that for the EU, climate action is actually very high on the agenda, and climate cooperation is also very high on the agenda. I just want to stress that of course, we'd like to see China to step up. We've heard already about the issue of climate finance, and we all believe that the responsibility should be shared, and I think the EU should have the biggest share of it. But it is true that China is now in a difficult position where the responsibility is increasingly falling on its shoulders as well. And we've noticed, unfortunately, that climate might not be as high on China's agenda as it used to be. One example is the COP venue. President Xi Jinping hasn't been to a COP since 2015, which is quite a long time. And we can assume that the climate is not, or at least COP is not very high on China's political agenda. So that's also why I feel like now that we know who will be going into the White House, it calls for a strong momentum for EU-China leadership on climate. It is not something that we can bargain on. This is something that is much more needed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jin, I'm going to come to you now, if I may. Building on what we've just been, what Angeline has been saying, is you've been studying this. You're an expert in many fields. How can we reconcile the differing approaches to AI and climate diplomacy from your perspective?
Okay, thank you, Chair. And also, it's my great honor to be here to share my thoughts on the interesting issue. I really like the spirit of the forum. That is the dialogue and the cooperation. It's a fact of life. There is cooperation competition, but it really depends on which you put more emphasis on. And today, actually, China and the EU are not so different as we expect. Let me say, even in climate change and the AI, areas, these two areas are important for us to set the future direction of transitions. So we have the same goals, we have the same challenges, actually. Even EU and China to take different policies, but we all have to balance. For example, in dealing with climate change, on one side, we have to keep climate change in mind. On the other side, we also talk about the so-called competitiveness. And at the same time, the social pillar of the transition must be focused. I think this is the same challenge for us. And also, I think in the past decades, China and EU have had very rich experiences of cooperation. China took a lot from EU experiences. If you look at Chinese way of dealing climate change, that is a so-called carbon market system that is to a large extent following the Europeans' model. And also, more specifically, as regards to the AI cooperation, we have to have the balance, the innovation, the risk control, the political aspect, and the technology aspect balance, et cetera, et cetera. So I think today, China and the EU have set the mechanism of cooperating, especially the high-level dialogue. The most important task for us, I think, is for two sides to build the strategic trust, to set the direction of transition. I think this is a precondition, of course, for more fruitful cooperation. And secondly, I think it's important for the two sides in a cooperative spirit to set the priorities. For example, we have mentioned a lot about the green financing. As a scholar working in China-Europe relations for almost 20 years, sometimes I find a very interesting phenomenon. When we solely focus our energy on the so-called geopolitical issues, political issues, at the dialogue times sometimes tend to be very tough. But sometimes I was invited to the conference on climate change. You don't know how harmonious the culture is. So actually, the enterprises, the technology experts are all very eager for the cooperation. So this is the second aspect I like to say. And the third one, I think is very important today to set the regulations and the norms together. I think that is the fundamental aspect for the future direction, not only in climate change area, but also in AI. I think the kind of framework should be open, should be fair, that consider the different characteristics of different actors here. So last but not least point I like to say, I always appreciate the kind of statement. The entrepreneurs are the best politicians in the world. We must let them to stay in the driver's seat. That is, to let the enterprises take the role of driver's seat to set the direction of cooperating. That, I think, is important for us today to talk more about cooperation and dialogue instead of so many Ds, deglobalization, decoupling, de-risking, and to avoid over-politicization and securitization of the cooperating in different areas. Thank you very much. I'd like to stop here.
No, Jen, thank you very much. And You know, I take your point about when you bring entrepreneurs together, they can create magic. But I'm sure that you're not referring to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos taking power in government as entrepreneurs. And I'm sure you don't mean that, but that's the, that's looking at the worst scenario possible. However, thank you very much. Wang, can I bring you in, and I will take some questions before we conclude. You've been an expert in Chinese foreign relations for decades, and especially with the issue of finance. I'd like you to kind of contribute or focus your contribution, if I may, on China's priority in its relationship with the EU. How would you describe it? Or what would you describe it as being?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Actually, I think my time is very limited. I just very briefly respond. Firstly, I think in the coming 4 years, Trump will return. China-Europe cooperation faces more opportunity. So I think strengthening cooperation with China is in line with Europe's long-term interest. We Chinese sincerely hope that China and Europe can cooperate like friends. But the problem is nowadays the EU positions China as a cooperation, competition, and a rivalry, which not only severely restrict the EU's foreign policy, but also put Europe in an increasingly awkward position in international stage. That's the first point I want to say. Second point is about the Ukraine crisis. I heard a lot of complaint from Europe to China, but I agree with Mr. Ambassador right now. You're talking about China's Russian policy, and also China has a very good relationship with Ukraine. And I have to say that I think that European friends need to have an objective understanding on China's position on Ukraine crisis. I know in the past 3 years, the European economy has been affected by the Ukraine crisis, but it is clear that this war was caused by the NATO's unlimited eastward expansion, and more clearly by the United States' offshore balancing strategy. So this war interrupted the process of the European independence, raised energy prices in Europe, and caused severe inflation in Europe. That's the second point I want to share. The third point I want to share is that right now the EU ambassador talking about the China and the EU bilateral trade. I think that China and Europe has a population of about 2 billion. China-Europe trade is sustainable, long-term sustainable. Firstly, China and Europe trade has characteristics of complementarity and mutual benefit. Second is we have the China-Europe trade, such an efficient and green logistic channel, new channel for bilateral trade. Third reason is that, of course, we mentioned a lot that we have the environmental, climate, green finance, Belt Road initiative. We have a lot of the new opportunity for trade sustainability. Final things I want to share is that because right now there are a lot of speakers talking about climate change. I think I have to say the climate responsibility. I think China, in the past 5 years, China has been the country with the fastest carbon emissions reduction in the world. We contribute the biggest carbon emission reductions responsibility in the world. That's true. Although China, we admit China is a country with the highest carbon emissions, but China is also the world's largest factory, producing over 30% of the world's goods. Don't forget, carbon emissions now are calculated based on the principle of production values. If calculated according to the consumption principle, China per capita carbon emissions are only 1/4 of those in the United States and 1/3 of most of the countries in Europe. So China may not be the largest carbon emitter. So for that, I think we should observe China objectively. Well, very quickly, last point regarding about the degree of the openness in Chinese market. I think indeed the competition in the Chinese market is extremely strong, and the competitiveness of Chinese interpreters is becoming increasingly strong nowadays. And in China, I don't know whether you know, in China, the average survival time for a new company, for Chinese new company, is only 2 or 3 years. So it's very obvious that for a European company investing in China do nowadays face the competition, very serious competition from the Chinese market. But this does not deny China's opening up policy. In fact, Chinese markets welcome European investment very, very much. And on the other hand, China also want to invest more in the Europe. So both sides should open up their market more. So this is my opinion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And colleague, and thank you very much for being patient and accepting the fact that I reordered the panel in favor of making sure we had women contributors come through earlier. Colleagues, I'm going to go up to 15:15 because we're meant to have had a break at 11, but I do want to enable a few more contributions. The only thing I'd say, Wang, is that your assessment of China's role in relation to the Ukraine crisis is at odds with what Ambassador Tang said. Ambassador Tang was very clear in saying NATO expansionism cannot be an excuse for a country to break international law. And it cannot justify invading a sovereign state and breaking the law as a result, and creating human strife and contradicting human rights policy across the globe. So I just think it's really important that we are clear about that, Ambassador Tang from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually did not say what you've just said now. So I think we need to make sure we're all on the same page around some of this, but do not, lest none of us, I think, in this room accept Russia's actions as being anything other than being in contradiction of international law and actually breaking certain concordats and simply invading a country and causing it such strife and calling into question not only regional peace but global stability as a result of its actions. So I want to ask a couple of people to raise hands for, we will take 2. Lady over there, with glasses. Anyone else? And the lady at the back there as well. Please, do introduce yourself.
I will. Thank you so much for your last words, Admandra. I really very, very much appreciate that you set the debate in the right direction. So I am not going to touch on Ukraine. I think you have made a very good point. I will touch, my name is Eva Valle. I work for DigiTrade. I'm the head of unit in charge of relations with East Asia, including China. I wanted to go back to the point about the deficit, echoing comments that Ambassador Toledo made and that their Ambassador Cai Run also contested and was mentioned several times. To put it a little bit in perspective, China says that the deficit is not something that they are seeking, but China has run a structural deficit with the European Union for many years. The deficit with the European Union reached a record level, as Ambassador Toledo said, of almost 400 billion euros in 2023. It went down to almost 300 billion euros in 2022, which is still huge. And that's in terms of volume, of value. Because in terms of volume, there are indications that the deficit is still at incredibly record high levels. Not seeking this deficit intentionally, but it happens to be the case that China runs a trade deficit with 75% of all of its trading partners, according to the data from the customs organization in China, GACC. So this is of concern. And let me clarify that the European Union has not been worried about figures per se. It's the reasons behind that deficit that concerns us. It's the industrial policies that focus on manufacturing and on exports through subsidies and state support. It's the policies of import substitution that reduce imports into China and push out exports. Those are the type of policies that we are concerned. I said yesterday that the European Union and China are competitors, and as Ambassador Toledo said today, he insisted on that point. I always believe that competition is good. I started my days in DG Competition, and the European Union is built on a competition, on markets competition. Our problem is when competition is not fair, and that is where concerns start. Ambassador Cai Run also mentioned as a possible cause of the deficit, if I understood correctly, the trade in dual use. Trade in dual use is restricted for very, very good reasons, and we have a lot of concerns that our trade in dual use are not fully respected. I draw your attention to the fact that there are a number of Chinese entities listed in our sanctions lists.
Yeah.
But trade in dual use is only 2.5% of overall trade of the European Union. It definitely is not the cause of the deficit.
Okay.
I don't insist.
No,
Thank you so much.
No, but I mean, we know the figures, they've been rehearsed. Some might say there's an issue of culture and economics. That, you know, two states have very different approaches to competition and how they, you know, have a much more autocratic approach to subsidies, whereas the EU is founded on a different set of principles. And, you know, that's perhaps the world we're entering into more so. I'm more interested just briefly commenting, if you can, what do you see as being the kind of direction of travel for the von der Leyen #2 Commission on EU-China relations? Can you comment?
I cannot comment. I can speculate, but very, very briefly.
Very briefly.
Because our commissioner College of Commissioners has only been approved like very, very recently. I would personally expect a significant degree of continuity, given that the president remains the president. Beyond that, it's pure speculation, and I think it's beyond my role.
Okay, thank you. Lady right at the back, I'd asked you to be literally 60 seconds.
Right.
Sorry.
Thank you. Lucina from Triligent. It's a tech consultancy, also specialized in geopolitics. So the question is, EU seems to actually get increasingly protective, and it's a trend that we see to be continued. I wonder, to the whole panel actually, with Trump re-election, do you think that EU can actually afford doing this and getting more protective? And how also China sees it? And with Trump re-election, what does this mean for China's foreign affairs? So yes, kind of very much trade.
So you're not going to get an answer, I'm afraid, because I'm going to close the panel. But I'd be interested in your view. What's your view on the question you've just asked? Really? Share. Because you're, you know, as you said, a tech consultancy. It would be great to get that perspective, which is you're not in the politics, you're not setting policy.
Right.
What's your view?
It's again going to be sort of my personal opinion, and we're very much thinking about this with a lot of our clients at the moment.
Yes.
It indeed looks like Europe will have a bit of an interim phase when they're just going to decide what's going to be the decisions that they make, because what we see is that the Commission, and with all the hearings lately, they have been very cautious and very careful, and it seems that Trump re-election also has been a bit of a reason for that, to just maybe take a step back and see what's going to be the future. But it's true that now Europe has more instruments in place that will just be easier to use, but it is just very worrying where this can get and to what extent they can use it. Yes, so I think that's my answer. To some extent.
No, thank you very much. Thank you all, because I've eaten up 15 minutes of your coffee break. We will resume at 12:30, or just after. We'll give you an extra 5 minutes. But thank you all. Thank you online, and thank all of you. I suppose the only salient point to make here is, let's keep the dialogue open despite tensions, because actually, you know, there's two things that we all have to remember. People and communities are people and communities in China and Europe and the world. We are human beings in different ways, in different contexts. And let's not forget, let's not forget, it's a really important point, regardless of politics and the kind and the shape and colour of politics, climate change sees no border. Climate change sees no border. So whether we want to kind of have any kind of discussion about who does what, the reality is, if half of China goes underwater or half of Europe goes underwater, where will the politics be? Just think about that for a moment. And secondly, AI sees no borders either. The actions of malign forces could easily hack a public bank institution as quickly as it can a health service, as it did in the UK. So let's kind of gain a sense of humility, of the forces that are not necessarily within our control, but to make sure we use our good nature to create common weal. Thank you very much for your attention and interest. Do stay for the second session. Thank you. Colleagues, hello, hello, hello. Can I ask you all to come back into the room, please? Bring your coffees with you. Coffees, cookies, or water, whatever. So please do. Please take your seats. Colleagues, and also our speakers, can you please take your seats? You can, it's free seating. So, okay, colleagues, if I can have your attention. So, those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the second session of this summit on EU-China relations in the context of the pending anniversary of 50 years of diplomacy between the EU and China, which will be next year. My name is Dharmendra Kanani, Chief Operating Officer and Chief Spokesperson for Friends of Europe, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, those who are joining us just now. For those of you who've stayed with us, thank you. Thank you for being with us and continuing to be with us. We've had a very significant conversation, obviously, on the issue of diplomatic relations and the tensions that are absolutely in front of us and we're experiencing in a world that's becoming even more complicated and more complex by the day. We're turning our attention to the issue of trade and navigating trade relations in a globalized world. The world has been globalized for some time, but the context for trade relations has never been more tense, and people are using tools such as tariffs as the watchword for future trade relations. That we have seen for the first time in decades a surge in protectionism across the world, yet denying the impact and the importance of open markets, because actually, if you're going to be protectionist and you need to access other people's markets, it's not going to work. So we need to be thinking about how do you maintain a level of openness, integration of markets without it seeping into geopolitics and a sense of a me-first politics that's likely to emerge in the coming decade or more. There's a kind of realism to EU-China trade relations. Both parties have succeeded mutually, respectively, in the relationship over decades. One would say, if you go by the numbers, it's definitely in favor of China versus the EU, but there's a reality that bites, and this figure, I think, says a lot. In the context that of the US, let's say the actual goods per day trade is 2.32 billion. 2.32 billion a day goods traded between both EU and China. That says a hell of a lot in terms of the relationship that's quite integrated and commonplace. Unwinding the clock on that is going to be hideously difficult. And I think we need to question ourselves, do we need to do that? The more important thing is, how do we build on a relationship that's been successful economically for both parties? Both parties has succeeded in creating employment, reduction of, let's say, goods and services become cheaper. But now, in the world that we find ourselves, in the context of both a post-COVID context, where public debt is the highest, we know that relations have become more tense in the context of the Ukraine war, and we know there's an energy crisis. And actually, there isn't a government, as we know from the IMF reports and others, that there isn't a government that isn't broke in terms of public debt. across the world. And so that creates a very heady combination of issues for any continent or regional marketplace to deal with in terms of trade relations. So there we go. Whoever's alarm that is it really mine? How embarrassing. Really, colleagues? Here's me looking at the audience, and it's here. That was, probably they programmed it to tell me to stop talking. There we go. We're going to kind of have a conversation around, as I said, trade. I want to apologize that right from the onset that what is evidently a manel, and that's nothing against you guys, but we have a policy of never having, a manel, because we always believe in making sure there's equity and equality on all our panels and making sure there are 50% of women in both the audience but also on the panel. Unfortunately, both our women speakers that were slated had to pull out at the last minute. They give their apologies, and it was, it wasn't, if it wasn't for a priority, they wouldn't have pulled out. So my apologies that we do have a manel, but let's hope we can make up for it in terms of the engagement with the audience. And as I said, nothing against you guys at all. I'm going to start with John. John, you've been a former EU trade negotiator. You're long in the tooth on these kinds of issues in terms of EU-China trade relations and trade relations more generally. Given where we find ourselves right now, John, what do you or rather, what or how should the EU reassess or assess its relationship with China? Over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for allowing me to address this distinguished audience. I'm reminded of the famous Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times." I think we are entering interesting times in the Chinese sense. There have been a lot of changes since 2019, when the EU last established its China strategy, and even more changes since the heyday of bilateral relations from 2000 to 2010. The pandemic, a recognition by all of us that we need to reduce excessive dependencies in our trade and production. A shift in Europe and in the USA, and also in China, I think, from embracing open trade to economic security and autonomy. The heydays of open trade, never mind free trade, are probably over for some time. And then here, a new commission, a new European Parliament, a new administration in the US waiting in the wings. Not a new Chinese president for the time being. I think he's there to stay for a bit longer. A much more assertive China, which has abandoned its Deng Xiaoping's concept of biding your time, hide your capacities. China is very assertive in economic terms and politically around the world. And of course, we have now the Trump 2.0 about to arrive. So the times have changed, as Bob Dylan might say. Now, how does this play into a reassessment of Europe's trade relations with China? The 2019 concept is that China is a partner, a competitor, and a rival. That's a bit out of date. And I think the incoming commission will be well advised to revise that rather blunt three-pronged strategy and have something much more sophisticated that reflects the current state of the world and economic relationship. You mentioned it yourself that China and the EU are mutually dependent on trade and FDI in a way that the USA and China are not. 2.3 billion euros a day of two-way trade. So, like it or not, and I like it, the EU and China are going to be very, very important trading partners in the next decades. In particular, if, as is the concern, the Trump 2.0 administration pulls the curtain down on trade with China. China will then need, even more than ever, the EU as a market and as a destination and source of FDI. And we tend to forget when we talk about diversification and de-risking, China is doing that as well, big time. Very, very rightly, it doesn't want to have all the eggs in one basket. So I think that will continue. I think that our future trade relationship will be very ambivalent and will require a balancing act from both Europe and China. The EU will have to navigate between the Scylla and Charybdis of the USA and China in the next 4 years. China will have to diversify and find a balance kind of geopolitically between its desire to have and I'll be very blunt, a weak Europe politically, but a strong Europe economically. Because for some time, China will need the European market. So I think China will have to find a balance. It wants to change the world order, fair enough. It wants to remove US Western Atlantic hegemony. That's a long-standing Chinese objective, and I don't comment on that, whether I agree or not. It's a reality. But if it does that in too abrupt and disruptive a manner, then that will create economic turbulence which China cannot afford to have in a situation where its own economy is flatlining, where there's massive overcapacity, and where the recent fiscal stimulus at state level is not going to reduce the debt overhang. So China will have to find a balance, I think, between progressively changing the world political order, but in a way which does not kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And when it comes to the EU, I hope that the EU will not be forced to choose between USA and China. I think the EU is big enough not to have to do that. The EU will play by the rules of the WTO when it comes to trade relations. That's Europe's strongest card. And you know, in the end, as a famous foreign minister once said, we have no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And I think that will dictate both Europe's and China's views on trade relations.
Do you think, I mean, before you put the mic down, John, that the reality of having to choose between the US and China, given what Mr. Trump's likely to do? There was a famous politician most recently. I was having, we were having dinner with a range of others, and he quite candidly said the only issue about Mr. Trump is he's an equal opportunities ass, and what that means is whatever suits the interests of America, he will work with, and so there's that sense of equality of, as long as it's in my interest, I'll do it. How do you see that panning out? Because against the same, we know there's a famous ambassador who once said that, if China sneezes, the rest of the world gets flu. Has that time gone by now?
Well, I think it's a bit early to over-speculate. We're all getting very excited
Indeed.
about the impact of Trump 2.0, the assumption that he's going to slap 60% or 100% tariffs on China and 20% on the rest. Let's see. I think he will be selective in his tariff policies because to put a sweeping tariff across everything is going to be very, very bad for the world economy and the US economy, which needs supply chains and inputs. So I don't think he is so stupid to do that. I think it will boil down to whether the new US administration wants to use trade policy and trade defense measures and tariffs solely as a way to reduce the trade deficit with China and others, or whether he and his acolytes want to use trade policy as a defense and security, a foreign policy instrument to leverage change around the world on Ukraine, on Gaza, on Taiwan, on whatever. Yeah, and I think it's not clear yet whether the next Trump trade regime will be geared to purely trade ends or foreign policy objectives.
Sure, thanks a lot, John. I'm sure colleagues in the audience, you will have views. experiences and thoughts, which we obviously want to welcome into this conversation. I'm going to turn to Cai. Thank you again, second year round, I believe, to the forum, and thank you for coming across with your delegation, the wider delegation from Beijing that you arrived yesterday. So really pleased to have you here. You're a seasoned diplomat. You've been in different parts. You've worked at the most senior levels in the Chinese government as well. Given the relationship to date, so if you reflect on the 50 years, if you like, what's your take on the lessons we need to learn, but also more importantly, what do we need to do as we move forward if we want to maintain the kind of, let's say, common good relationship between EU and China?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm extremely happy to be back in Brussels, especially as a member of the delegation headed by the distinguished ambassadors over here. Allow me to make several brief points. The first point I want to make is that I suspect that if mankind 100 years later look back at today, either today's forum or today's global situation, they may actually conclude that we are at a major turning point in human history. Why? Because Mr. Donald Trump and his team are pledging a revolution against the United States. They want to do all kinds of revolutionary things about the Pentagon, about the civil service, cutting lots of federal employees, etc., and do major revolution to the ways, how things are done in the United States. And, of course, Donald Trump wants to do this MAGA again in a more intensified form. As being educated in New Haven for 4 years, I always cannot understand what exactly this MAGA means. Because to me, I always thought the United States was great. So I thought maybe Donald Trump meant to make America greater again, rather than great again. I would say the United States is a great country. It has its own shortcomings, of course. But allow me to make a very important proposal today in my own capacity. I think if Donald Trump can really keep the promise of ending the war in Ukraine within 24 hours or a week or whatever it is, and then also honor his promise not to wage war, not to use war as an instrument of U.S. politics in the world, I would urge all of us to join together to nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Really, I'm serious. If the United States for the coming 4 years will refrain from using war and using peaceful means to solve whatever problems there are, they may be high-handed, they may manhandle many countries, etc., but no war by the United States for the 4 years to come, and ending the war in Ukraine should be a major achievement. So that's my proposal, and I hope we will be closely watch the situation and do accordingly, depending on Mr. Trump's performance in the coming 4 years. Now, we talked a lot about maybe the collapse of the liberal democracy, for example, and EU need to revise or revamp its own roadmap, etc. Allow me to share with you what has been with me for all these years. And I used to work for Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China. He always said, don't argue, don't split your ideological hair. And China split a lot of ideological hair. By the end of the 1978, China was locked up in a very big ideological box. China debated among themselves against each other and concluded that whatever socialist must be good, whatever capitalist must be bad. But then if you look at China's economic performance with the Europeans, for example, or the Japanese or the Americans, then you should conclude otherwise, because China's economy was not doing very good. Therefore, Deng Xiaoping came up with this one, and I want to share this with you, with all the Europeans here. Deng Xiaoping said, development is the hard truth. Now, don't engage in ideological hair-splitting with each other. You work and you achieve. You develop your economy. And I think that is what China has been doing ever since 1978. The Chinese people, my people, work so hard. You know, when we see Europeans demonstrate or boycott or strike, etc., in China, most of the people worry that if they do not work long enough, they want to work beyond the 8 hours or in the weekend, during the holidays, etc. And this kind of hard-working spirit is really the driving force behind China's fundamental transformation. Now, another point, very interestingly, I listened very carefully to what Ambassador Cai, it's pronounced as Cai, said, and I was intrigued that this Cai, C-A-I, is the same as CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement of Investment between China and the EU.
He's not here to hear this, obviously. I'm sure you'll tell him this, yes.
You see, China has lots of distinguished ambassadors, and CAI, Mr. Cai, is not the largest family name in China. But it may be providently arranged that China now had Mr. Cai as the ambassador to EU. And I do have another recommendation. I hope between now and January the 20th, 2025, you think it's impossible, it's a miracle, China and EU scramble into action and get this CAI signed up. Really, we cannot wait anymore. Let me share with you why. I'm afraid that when Donald Trump becomes the president on January the 20th, he and his team may do whatever they can at their disposal to prevent China and EU to talk about CAI, even though the Chinese ambassador is Mr. CAI. Is that right? So I think we need to scramble into action. You may say, this is impossible, mission impossible, we do not have enough time, and in EU we have enough, for example, resistance against this kind of China-EU cooperation. And I'm really very much intrigued by the comments made by some of the Europeans this morning. They call China-EU relations as cooperation, competition, and rivalry. You remember, Mao Zedong said, Chairman Mao, the founder of the People's Republic of China, he always said, if you want to do a revolution, you need to decide first who is your friend and who is your enemy. If you do not get these very important things right, holy cow, your revolution will end up with a disaster. So I hope I can use this opportunity to again appeal to my European friends. China is not an enemy of Europe, and the Chinese people are not enemies of the European people. If you go to China with me, you will see a lot of admiration in China for many things Europe. For example, when we talk about the EV car, I'll be finishing very shortly. EV car, Germany helped China a great deal in the 1980s to transfer technologies and capital to help China's automobile industry, the fuel car industry. Now, I think, rather than EU and China get at each other's jugular, we need to work out something so that China and Europe, China and German companies, for example, can really cooperate. We can use almost the same method. That is, in the early 1980s, the German companies came up with money, technology, etc. The Chinese company, mostly Chinese local government, provided land. They provided labor force, for example. They provided training, etc. And by now, China's production is more than 30 million automobiles a year for 2023. You never see such a large number in human history. One single country producing 30 million cars plus. And now there is a revolution. This EV revolution is really shaking up the world. I would say for the EV revolution, it is not a competition between China and Germany or China and the United States or China and Japan. The real competition, allow me to share with you my view, is between fuel car, which is a technology of the past, and the European companies did it very well, and the EV car technology, which is a technology of today and of tomorrow. Because EV car has a completely different ecosystem which can be seamlessly integrated with the digital world, with the AI world. So you do not want to make the German automobile industry the second version of Kodak. You do not really want to force the German automobile industry into the corner and eventually they collapse, for example, under the weight of the fuel car industry. Finally, allow me to mention another final point. I think from the Chinese perspective, we are very much grieved by the European eagerness to put sanctions on Chinese EV car. Why? Because I'm very much aware of this. I was partially participating in this. About 12 years ago or 13 years ago, China made a major decision to bet on the EV car revolution. But at that time, there was no assurance that China's bet will be successful. You can bet a huge amount of money and eventually you end up with a disaster. But China's bet on the EV was very much driven by China's commitment to fight against the consequences of the climate change. It's China's very important way to cut down emission, for example. And now, when I walk around in Europe, few European friends say, China, you did very well in coming up with a EV car because it really helps mankind as a whole to reduce the carbon emission. Let's call a spade a spade. Don't weaponize this EV trade or EV car. And I will be the happiest person if, for example, one day, China and Europe, be with Germany or France or Italy or other countries, we really figure out a new way of doing business. That is China-Europe cooperation in making sure that this EV revolution does not get by Europe. It's very much happening in Europe, helping creating high-quality jobs in Europe. That's my wish, and I hope you will share with me. And also, you will agree with me that Victor Gao, China, the Chinese people are not enemies of the European people. We should be friends. We should work together. We should create miracles, especially, for example, as we expect that Washington may manhandle both China and Europe starting on January the 20th. I suspect some of the Europeans say, well, the Americans may manhandle China more than Europe. But that's not the right criteria. If America can make America great again, we should be very happy. But if America wants to make America great again at European cost, I will not agree. And if America wants to make America great again at Chinese cost, I hope you will not agree. So let's do the right thing. Let's do things which can really honor our decency and respect, for example. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I didn't expect anything less from Victor. I mean, last year he gave a kind of a rabble-rousing performance, and again, this year again, obviously you raise the temperature in a number of ways, but you call things out, whether people agree with you or not. But you do set out a very, let's say, thought-provoking agenda and a set of comments for all of us to think about. And I think that your commentaries about the EV are going to be quite interesting in terms of the reaction we get. And I love the fact that, you were saying that we, rather than being congratulated, people are seeing China in the way they are, that, the electric vehicle is saving human and mankind. But you also need to balance that against the emissions issue, which I think that we need to have an open conversation about. It's not all straightforward. But thank you very much. I'm going to go now to Gerhard. Gerhard, thank you for being here also. What I'd like you to focus your contribution on, given that you're a scholar, you've been again just like others on this panel, long in the tooth on these relations. What are the practical things that could be done to ensure that tensions and trade difficulties don't escalate? So, what are the de-escalation mechanisms we need to be thinking about?
Thank you for allowing me to participate in this interesting discussion and to take up your question. What can we do? I think the first big start is to rebuild trust. We have heard this morning already the facts, and so far I don't go into the difficulty. But what we have maybe not mentioned enough is how much of trust has been lost during the last years, and this has been linked to several elements. We had also this COVID period, where also, unfortunately, a lot of personal contact stopped, a lot of economic contact stopped, and where we also have seen that supply chains broke down and we discovered that this globalized world on which we all relied with a very efficient supply chain, that this has a risk. And so, and then we have seen the consequences of the unmanaged globalization benefits in countries. That means the losers of globalization protested, and this is the debate about the United States and the two parts of the United States, the one who have lost out in the Rust Belts, and Wall Street and others who are big invested in globalized economy. So we have seen that all these elements undermined very much the trust in the international economy and has allowed that a lot of negative narratives developed. And I made an effort, and knowing the United States fairly well, have been invited there, having met Mr. Clinton. So I made an effort to look into all the resolutions of the Congress. And I have a high admiration of the Congress. And I could see the Washington consensus establishing a very negative narrative about China, an element of danger for the United States and a danger for world peace. So we suddenly have lost trust in economic relations because of all these elements which we have seen. And now answering your question more concretely, how to rebuild trust. The first step, I think, is that we have to understand the situation of our countries far better. And if you allow me to make some comments on China, and I'm obviously very pleased if my comments then are corrected by the Chinese colleagues, I think also we have to understand that China is under also big economic difficulties, which also leads to decisions which affects the outside negative. I remember that before COVID, China has very well advanced in reducing trade imbalances. And one could see already that the Chinese economic model based on export orientation was starting to change and that private consumption was climbing up. After COVID, we discover that the export-driven model has been re-established. Why? Because China has difficulty in the construction sector, which is too big. China cannot simply use fiscal stimulus as in the past, because China has also deficit problems with the local governments. So therefore, China answers in a prudent way its own economic difficulties by not changing completely its model and allowing that the strong forces of China, and this is the export industry, helps to overcome Chinese problems. What is a pity is that in this balanced internal reaction, the consequences for others are not sufficiently seen. And what also is a pity is if the outside world is seeing in this balanced economic answer in China a strategy to undermine others. It's not a strategy to undermine others, it's a strategy to overcome their own economic difficulties in a way which has less cost for China, but which creates a lot of cost for others. And then we come what is needed. And this is, we have to restart this debate about the new rules. The Washington consensus about a simplistic idea of a liberal economic model is over. We have now to understand that China has its own model with state support, but also with very active provinces. So in contrary to a lot of wrong ideas about China, that you have Beijing who is orchestrating an industrial policy, China is a very active, competitive society where also provinces are engaging in supporting companies. So we have to accept that this Chinese model exists and will not fall into our demands of a liberal textbook model. So Europe is reacting on this. We are building our own instruments to be able to compete with such a model which has an industrial policy and Europe tries to build up its own industrial policy. So if we understand better Chinese model, and if China understands better that Europe also is to a certain extent a developing country, because we have also big differences. We are also have our difficulty to stay competitive, and therefore, coming back to the electric car as my last comment, I think this is a very good example how we practically can solve problems. Because the EU followed the rules. It used custom duties, but not against China, about cars produced in China. So one of the biggest victims of this decision is BMW, a German company who produces a lot of electric cars in China and who has even higher custom duties than some Chinese companies, because the EU tried to stick to the rules. And I think we all agree electric cars are the answer for a lot of climate problems. Insofar, it is beneficial to have a lot of electric cars in Europe. And if they are cheaper, customers can buy them. So, progress for climate policy. On the other side, looking to the own way how China is opening up its markets, changes must be managed. So if you have a key industry who is losing too quickly too many jobs, you will not be able to survive this economic change. Insofar, one has to give the European car industry the time to adapt also with Chinese technology, with Chinese investments into Europe, its new capacity to compete also in the electric market. And this means we have to understand that you need an orderly change of an economic key sector in Europe. And for this, we can negotiate, saying we accept certain limitation of the number of imported cars for a certain period of time, knowing that with this also Chinese investment should come into Europe, battery productions, Chinese companies have joint ventures with European companies. You know that Volkswagen already has joint ventures in China. So I think your picture of benefiting now in Europe from the Chinese technological lead is a good story if we give enough time for adaptation.
In practical terms, though, what would you advise the von der Leyen Commission to do as of next year, given what you've just said? Because trust can be seen as a nebulous thing, but it's an important thing. And you've dissected the kind of context in which trust is kind of, if you like, diminished. And you've drawn references to the type of either liberal or diversity of economic models that the world is now subject to. It's not just one doctrine of the West, if you like. And so, you know, we know that we talk about China, but India is going to is growing at a speed, and its economic trajectory is likely to overshadow China and Europe and the United States potentially. So we're living in a very different world. But in terms of this particular topic, what are the practical things you think the VDL Commission number 2 should be doing?
First, I think the Commission should initiate with the European Parliament as the main difficult actor in this area a ratification of the Comprehensive Investment Agreement. I think, unfortunately, this agreement, which was negotiated for 7 years and was agreed in the Council in the last days of the German presidency, has been blocked in the European Parliament. So I think it would be a good sign of rebuilding trust if a new effort can be made to ratify this Comprehensive Investment Agreement. But this also means that Europe already takes a stance towards the United States, because it was very much also the criticism from the United States at this period of time, and it will be not different now if Europe ratifies this comprehensive investment agreement, because the United States demands that Europe joins into this US-China rivalry. So I would say if the European institutions are able to deblock the comprehensive investment agreement, this would be a very big success. I'm not sure whether it will be possible. This depends very much on the also discussion in the European Parliament. And the next concrete step, rebuilding trust from the European side, and then I can maybe make proposals for the Chinese side, but from the European side, it also would be to present a new EU-China strategy and somehow correct a wrong notion of strategic rivalry. I think this is somehow giving too much prominence to this more geopolitical confrontation debate, coming out a bit of US-China's rivalry. We should stick on the competition, on the economic issues. These are difficult issues, but these are the issues which can be handled. We should not go into an ideological concept like rivalry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see. I mean, obviously, that the agreement has been long-standing, and I'm not sure what the appetite will be within the Parliament to do as you suggest. But let's see. Let's build on the US elements. And thank you again. Welcome back. It's good to have you. Could you comment on what you think is the likely impact of, the economics, the economic relations, if you like, between EU-China in the context of a Trump second term?
Thank you, Kazani. Especially thanks for this opportunity. Go back to Friends of Europe as an older friend of Europe. Indeed, we need to have some more time to discuss a very important issue of the trade, especially in the relations between China and Europe. For this session, we do have two, I think, keywords for this discussion. One of them is trade, another is globalized world. So once we touch the issue of how could we look at this influence, maybe potential influence from this, maybe not an elephant in the room, already elephant in the White House. Donald Trump, what he will do, and the potential impact on China and the EU relations, especially economically. I think if we look at, firstly, we can get some experience from his, first term, 8 years ago. Frankly, we solved a lot, for both China and the EU, even on the urge of the trade war between European Union and the United States. But I would like to point out a very important thing is, even during the Biden administration, there is not a solution. In the problem between European Union and the United States on some steel and aluminum taxes or tariffs. So I think it could not be a very big change, indeed, once Trump go back to the White House, because not only Trump administration and also Biden administration, I think that there is not a final solution for these tensions between Europe and the United States. Why? We can find out some fact from this, even a competition, a real competition in trade, in industries between Europe and the United States. So I think that firstly, we need to understand that once Trump go back to the White House, certainly there will be more drastic or even more tensions between the United States and Europe. Of course, the same thing will happen for the trade relations between China and the US. If we look at the promise from Mr. Trump, say that, okay, there will be more than 60% of tariffs against China and some other. So now I think it gives a very, very important question for both of us. Frankly, we do have, narrow choices in the front of the situation. I think firstly, yes, we need to act not so, in a panic, just like Mr. Borrell mentioned that like a rabbit in front of a headlight of a car. I think it could be a common challenge for both of us. Once there is a so-called average 10% or to 20%, tariffs from Washington against Brussels, we can estimate roughly 1.5 GDP loss for European Union. What does it mean? Which means that there will be zero growth for European Union economy. And also for China, most pessimistic estimation could be maybe nearly 2% of GDP loss from these tariffs from Washington to Beijing. So now the big question is, how could we take some action or reactions? Now I think that the European Union is trying to have a kind of a two-step tactics or strategies to deal with this situation. One of them, yes, try to have some negotiation with Mr. Trump and his team. I think it's a very big effort from the European Union side, because always negotiation and to take use of some normative power, always the big advantage for European Union. But now the question is, Mr. Trump will go to the negotiation table or not? I think if we believe that the experience for the first term for Mr. Trump, I'm not so optimistic about the future or the scenario. Mr. Trump will go back to the negotiating table, and then of course European Union will prepare a list of retaliation or some more tariffs against United States. But still, I think that yes, there are two-step tactics or strategies. On this regard, I think there is more space for China and Europe. We should have some more dialogue or communication, because we are facing the common challenges, not a kind of a mutual threat. On this regard, I think that now it's time for us to go back to maybe some more original or more fundamental issue, that what's the essence of trade? Frankly, if we believe our experience for the past more than 4 decades, I think we should believe that the essence of trade is exchange. Exchange for what? Firstly, exchange, experience. I agree with Mr. Gao mentioned that, yes, long times ago, even at the very beginning of opening up and reform period, China learned a lot from a European side, experience, and also exchange for technology, exchange of cultures, exchange of benefit or some other. But now recently, I think that a very, very big problem or challenge for the trade relations between China and Europe is somebody or some institutions, they are trying to change the essence of trade, a kind of a weaponization of trade. Also, from China's perspective, the so-called economic security strategy and also de-risking policy towards China, a kind of efforts to change the essence of trade. It always regard China as a threat or as a risk, because China become more and more, assertive, just like John mentioned. But a very, very interesting thing is when European Union regard China as assertive, and the European Union encouraged itself, say that our Europe could be more assertive. So assertive for China is wrong, but assertive for European Union is right. So I think that's a very, very big question we need to deal with. It is we should find a more equal not a double standard. Estimation or understanding or views with each other. And finally, I think that we have to go back to a very original starting point. Is if we look at of course, next year will be a 50th anniversary for China and EU relations. If we are seriously to look at the history, we can find that the approach or path for this bilateral relations between China and Europe is starting from trade exchange, okay? And then we try to find out more positive spillover effect from this common interests from the trade. For example, we have now strategic exchange. Now we have people-to-people contact. But recently, unfortunately, because of change of international order or regional situation, there are some more, concerns from European Union side on this so-called, they need to limit the space of trade, and they try to have some more, we call the politicization and the securitization, mindset on this area. I think it gives a very complicated situation now for the China-European Union trade relations. If we look at the e-waste issue, once it's just conventional trade friction, both China and the European Union, we do have a lot of experience to deal with it, to resolve it. But now the complicated situation is there are some more mindset consideration from the European Union side on so-called strategic level and also some security level. So it gives us some more, I think, long economic, consideration and to complex this situation. But finally, I still optimistic for these relations between China and the EU on trade, because even for the European Union side, it has to realize that there will not be the way of decoupling with China. So how could it find out a balance between, development, its relations with China in trade, industry, and also to take care of some, especially domestic requirement on so-called security or identity, some other. I think that now, yes, United States is calling a kind of Mr. Trump, MAGA, Make America Great Again. Perhaps it's time for European side to call for a kind of Make Europe Great Again. I think China may be a similar situation, but now I think we need to find out a consensus in which way or in which approach we can get, great again.
Okay.
I think that finally,
that was your third final,
by cooperating with each other, yes. So I think finally we should find a conclusion is, no matter what happens for Europe and China, United States, and I think for both China and Europe, we are most constructive force in the world currently. So make cooperation great again could be the final conclusion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your commentary. Colleagues, I want to open up to you. What do you make of this? What are you making of the kind of situation and discussions we're having? We have a hand up already. I would like some more hands up as well, if that's great. I've already given you, I will bring you in later, but gentlemen, so first lady there in the, there, the hands up. Could you just put your hand up a bit higher? So, lovely. Do introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Pascaline Gavory, Pilots for Dev. That was a very interesting debate. Thank you very much. I think there is a joint challenge which we have not approached, which is the Sustainable Development Goals 12, which is about sustainable production and consumption, which I think is one of the major challenges that there is in common, and which is not always guaranteed to trade. Because we've talked a lot about electric vehicles, and indeed, electric vehicles are part of the energy transitions, but they will not have a substantial impact on climate change. And I think it was also in the European interest to make sure that there were not too many electric vehicles available on the European market. And at the same time, the sustainable production and consumption will also show that even when we talk about electric vehicles, the pollution is also a little bit, would say, decentralized from a European perspectives, and that there is also a joint interest in protecting the ecosystems, both in Europe and in China. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for your point. But isn't one of the things that I'm not sure so much so in China, but in the EU and elsewhere, especially in the EU, one of the biggest mistakes politically is to say to a lot of people, you can't drive your old car into the centre of town, or there's limited access, when the impact of that decision, those decisions, are on the poorest, who can't afford an electric vehicle, who can't afford to make the transition. And in effect, we're creating a whole community of climate deniers and fanatics as a result, because they're thinking, why all of a sudden am I being asked to change my life when they've known it for all this time? So there's a kind of political, economic decision-making that's taking place that is actually reinforcing divisions in society. And I think that whilst the goal is great, I think how politics is making decisions is affecting those who are the poorest in our community not to be able to make the transition, and then feel that why should they have to, because the decision's been too late. We had gentleman there with the glasses. I will bring you in. Please.
Yes, thank you.
Introduce yourself and your question.
A reporter from China News Service.
Sorry?
Reporter from China News Service. Thanks, Ms. Gao made a very interesting comparison to the Cai, CAI. I want to ask the question about the CAI, the Cai. Because we all know the Cai was put on hold for a long time because of the mutual parliamentary sections between EU and China. And from the panelists, from your perspective, maybe even in a technical way, how can we just break the standstill, and kickstart the ratification process for the Cai, especially in the European Parliament?
Do you have, whilst you've got the mic, what's your confidence level on that?
I'm sorry?
What's your confidence level of being able to break the deadlock?
If you give me 1 to 10, I think my confidence is just 5.
Thank you for that. At the back there, lady with the glasses.
Thank you so much. Is this on? It's on, sorry. Well, maybe John wants to take some of these questions. Apologies.
I'm not asking you to take a question, but please, again, just for the benefit of everyone, introduce yourself, please.
Okay. I introduce myself. Again, I am Eva Valle. I'm the head of the trade unit that deals with relations with East Asia, including China. I rather had 3 comments, so apologies. I really don't want to kidnap this session, which is very interesting.
Would you hold your mic up a bit closer? So
okay, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. My first comment is protection versus protectionism. The EU does not engage in protectionism. What we are doing is reacting to unfair trade practices and protecting our companies that are suffering injury, scrupulously applying the WTO rules in a very, very legal and very, very measured manner. We are not closing our market. I heard from Mr. Gao, who chooses his words very carefully, sanctions on Chinese EVs. We have not imposed any sanctions. We have applied legally compatible WTO countervailing duties to countervail illegal subsidies. That is all that we have done, and we are very happy and confident to defend our decision that has been very duly motivated, showing subsidies to producers of electric vehicles in China from the mine to the port. We are very confident to defend this decision at the WTO, and that is the type of measure that we should be taking. Again, there are legal recourse, and we should not engage in weaponization, in launching spurious cases with retaliatory intent. Then on Cai, I have to react. It was concluded in principle by the end of 2020, and a lot happened afterwards and since. Indeed, the EU imposed certain sanctions, measured, controlled, legal, on a number of Chinese entities, and China reacted with countermeasures imposing sanctions on 10 individuals and 4 entities. These included MEPs, the Subcommittee of Human Rights of the European Parliament, the Council Political and Security Committee, think tanks, the actors of our democracy, and the very actors that would have had to ratify that agreement. Those sanctions are still in place. Moreover, a lot has happened since. We have seen the position that China is taking with respect to Russia. We are very concerned about weaponization of trade and investment relations, about imbalance. And our priority right now is as our president has explained many times, de-risking, not decoupling. Nobody is decoupling from China. We do not want, it's not in our interest, nobody seeks decoupling. We seek to de-risk, to minimize excessive strategic dependencies that can be weaponized and can affect and undermine the resilience of our economy. Last, a short word on building trust. This was also the subject of my intervention last year. I hear very, very often Chinese partners calling for building trust. I think that is fantastic. I think trust needs to be built by more than words. We have never disengaged from China. We have been dialoguing at every level throughout the years. Dialogue will continue. That's also another of the calls. But dialogue needs to deliver, and trust needs to be backed by facts, not by weaponization of trade and investment relations, not by very broadly formulated export controls without dual-use justifications that just send very, very worrisome messages to the international community. Apologies for taking so long. Thank you.
If I may, as I asked the gentleman there who raised the issue about the comprehensive investment agreement, what's your level of confidence in it even being revived?
I cannot answer that question. Apologies. Thank you.
She's a civil servant, and I knew that. But I'm glad you got the opportunity to say you can't say it. But thank you very much. Gentleman here. Just at the front.
Hi, Chen Wei, China Daily again. I have a question regarding what John just said when you said EU should not be forced to choose between China and US. How do you think that is realistic, or it's just a wishful thinking? If you look at the outside the US influence in EU in every aspect, and if you read the headline 2 years ago on Political, it's Ursula von der Leyen, Europe's American president. That's the headline on Political. And also, everyone, the keyword today is Trump, for obvious reason. But, the news reports here in Europe already suggest that, the GOP China hawks already contacted the Commission. Some EU officials suggest that it might be a good idea to, join the US to be tough on China in avoid to be spared by the Trump's tariff war. That's not a principle. That's not moral, in my view. So your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. But also do remember, colleague, that you're talking about reportage rather than actual statements. I think it's important that we say this is on Politico, and whilst I respect that outlet a lot, we are talking about journalism, and we're talking not that journalism has to be fake, but it's a reporting of issues that we must be mindful of. John, can I turn to you first for reflecting on some of the issues that have been raised so far?
Sure. On the last question first, I'm quite sure that the European Union will continue in the next 4 years to trade and invest heavily in and with the USA, and to trade and invest heavily in and with China. So in that sense, there will not be a binary choice between allying with the US and cutting trade relations with China, or the opposite. There will be some difficulties, some tensions, that's quite clear. But it'll depend on two things, I think. One, the extent to which Trump does introduce very, very radical trade restrictions. That will determine our reaction. And secondly, the extent to which China continues to bankroll and support Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. That will inevitably colour the European Union's relations with China, also in the trade sphere. Can I say a couple of words about on other things that I heard?
Providing the opportunity, please.
Yeah, on the not the CIA, the CAI.
The CAI.
Okay. I had the privilege of negotiating what is the first and still only trade agreement between EU and China, the one on geographic indications.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Which was concluded at the same time as the CAI. And I had the privilege of actually going to the Great Hall of the People. I met President Xi. My commissioner was there. President Macron was there on a state visit, and he pretended that he'd got the agreement and it wasn't the Commission.
Of course.
That's fine. But the point I'm making is that agreement was unanimously supported and endorsed by the Council and the Parliament, and of course the Chinese side. In a situation where, on the other side, the CAI was not supported by the Parliament because of the political and sanctions-related baggage that came with it, relating to the treatment of the Uyghur population. But it shows that the Parliament is not completely immune to putting a trade agreement before political or human rights issues. And it may be, I'm not advocating this, I'm just speculating, it may be that the new European Parliament, which is perhaps less attached to human rights, I'll be very, very blunt, may look a bit more sympathetically at the CAI in a climate where Europe's competitiveness is diminishing, and where this agreement would be quite beneficial for Europe in terms of getting more stable and predictable investment access to the Chinese market. So I think we should watch this space. There was a Chinese delegation came to the European Parliament a couple of weeks ago, exploring, I think, very, very gently whether it's possible to re-establish a relationship between the NPC and the European Parliament. And I think the CAI is very much behind that olive branch that the Chinese side extended.
Thank you, John. Gerard.
Maybe to take up this good description of the situation for the comprehensive investment agreement. And I think it was good to repeat the facts that this has been the result of mutual sanctions. But it also means that we have seen a situation where trade has been weaponized more and more. And if we leave aside the Ukraine question, which we have discussed, and as long as this war is raging, it is not possible to come back to an, you could say, independent trade policy from geopolitics. But our objective, nevertheless, should be that we stop the weaponizing of trade. And you could see this well before the Ukraine crisis. You could see this looking to the different reports about human rights abuses, where different countries have shown that other countries are not reflecting human rights. And we all know that the EU is based on human rights, and we are a political system based on human rights. But we should have the human rights debates where we can handle this collectively. And this is in the United Nations. We have a long tradition of human rights debates in the United Nations. We have found an agreement even in the United Nations of combining human rights with development rights under the title Sustainable Development Goals. And there you find also human rights elements. So I think we should give back the debate about human rights to the international community and stopping to use human rights as instruments of geopolitical competition. This will be not an easy exercise, but I think it will be the only exercise to stop that trade is misused with the argument of human rights for geopolitical and individual reasons.
It's quite a bold statement there, Gareth, because in the sense that trade has ever thus been about security, at least from when you think about it from the European perspective and the US perspective. There's always been a relationship between the sense of security and stability of nations which are in development, or are those which are important to the security and economic interests of the United States or Europe. It is ever thus. So I find what you're saying slightly difficult to understand. And are you saying that, for example, the EU project, which is based on both the market and human rights, should suspend its interest in human rights and, I suppose, outsource it to the UN?
Obviously not at all. I see I risk to be misunderstood. Human rights is a basis of EU actions, and we are a human right-based political system. Sure. Also, our member states in the constitutions have the obligations to respect human rights.
Other than Viktor Orban, obviously.
And we have also decided legislation, for example, the supply chain legislation, where companies are obliged to look into the supply chain to guarantee that they are not child labor, that they are not human rights conditions in their supply chain. In this sense, we are following a human rights policy orientation. But what I was commenting was the way how the human rights debate has become a geopolitical instruments amongst member states, using their different human rights reports, not for advancing human rights, but advancing other geopolitical interests. And this we have to answer, to make human rights a collective progress and not an instrument for geopolitical competition.
Great, thank you, and thank you for responding to my challenge there. But we also know from experience that, when issues where rights or the potential violation of rights are raised in agreements like Gazprom with Russia, where there was a lot of advice, don't do this, but Europe did, and you can see the consequences of that. But let me make sure. I want to bring the other panelists.
And we have human rights dialogue, not to forget, between the EU and China. So this is important to advance concrete problems. But my comment was relating to the misuse of human rights for other purposes.
Indeed. Victor, if I may.
Thank you. We talked about CAI and the mutual sanctions by EU against some of the Chinese entities and China against some of the EU entities. I would say this is very easy to resolve. I would urge the Chinese side and the EU side to consider lifting these sanctions simultaneously, so these sanctions will no longer be an issue. As a matter of fact, for those who don't know, Mr. Donald Trump nominated Marco Rubio as the incoming Secretary of State. Chinese government sanctioned Rubio twice for his egregious violation of the One China policy. So we have bigger worries to really deal with, and the China-EU sanctions, holy cow, this is really not an issue at all. And therefore, let's really create the condition that EU and China re-engage with each other and say, at the same time, simultaneously, all these sanctions are lifted. And then we go directly into the CII. Now, the other thing, you may know, for quite a few years, I was the co-chairman of Daiwa Security Japan for their Asia-Pacific, for their Greater China business. And Japan used to be the largest economy in Asia and the second largest economy in the world for 48 years. Then in 2010, China surpassed Japan. And do you know by now, One China is more than 3 times as big as Japan. So Japan never complains about being left behind by the Chinese economic development. Now, I say this to really share my own concern with the Europeans. The Chinese economy, I think, is about the same, if not a little bit larger than the EU economy by now. And I would say, if we do not take action, 4 years after Mr. Trump's administration, the Chinese economy may be significantly larger than the Europeans. And then, if you think about 2030, 2035, etc., maybe the Chinese size of the economy may be much greater than the European economy. Now, the other thing, for your information, I think while CAI is in a limbo right now, I understand the Chinese government has already taken unilateral steps to incorporate some of the promises and commitments that China entered into with the EU while negotiating for the CAI into domestic legislation. That's, again, a very strong indication to show that with or without EU, China wants to continue the reform and opening to the outside world. China wants to do the right thing because China does believe without democracy, there will be no modernization. So when you talk about human rights, we should be on the same page. We should really talk about human rights, democracy, modernization, industrialization, intellectual property rights, protection, etc. But my concern is that if Europe or EU as a whole wait again and again and again and again, what happened to Japan after 2010 may very soon happen to EU as a whole. And then you may not get the best of the deal. That's the problem. I think, finally, we really talked about AI. I think if you adopt a global view looking at the AI revolution, I think China and the United States are really pushing to the forefront. EU, where is EU in the AI revolution? It's not very much actively involved. Therefore, I think, wake up, because if EU or European countries are left behind by this AI tsunami, holy cow, this probably will be something that you will find it very difficult to catch up. And I coined the term called the AI divide. AI divide between persons, I may have a bigger kind of implant than yours, between companies, between societies, between countries, and between continents, between international organizations. My concern for Europe are two. One is this AI divide is coming, and Europe or EU may be caught up on the wrong side. The other one, you may know I double up as the chairman of China Energy Security Institute. I care about security on the one hand and energy on the other hand very closely. Europe is being burdened by this excessively high, expensive energy. When I heard your commissioner, whom I highly respect, saying, well, you are still using Russian gas, you know, the Americans have LNG. She didn't tell you. The LNG is minimum twice as more expensive, not 3 times, and in sometimes 4 times as expensive as piped gas. Therefore, my job as the chairman of the China Energy Security Institute is always to focus on the availability, sustainability, affordability of energy. If a country or EU as a whole is being plagued by such expensive oil or gas, your industry most likely will run into guts. That's the problem. So I think to share with my European friends, wake up, look at the AI, look at the energy sustainability and affordability. Don't do geopolitical games at your own disadvantage. That's the problem.
Victor, thank you. Thank you very much. No, thank you. I mean, one of the points that, you know, on AI, you know, you're absolutely right. And also, we all know, I mean, those in Europe already know that we're basically the cloud and the capacity in the cloud is owned by the US. Europe has no stake currently in it, unfortunately, and it's left it too late. And you're quite right about that. And I think that on the AI, equally, one of the concerns we've raised is the, I suppose, the lack of increase in R&D as a percentage of GDP. We've seen what's happened in China as a result of how much you invest in R&D. We've seen what's happened in the US because of the percentage of R&D of GDP, that they invest, and we can see what happened to Japan. Europe has sadly not done so. But I think, as I was saying at the conclusion of the first panel, I think malign actors on AI and also climate change are borderless. And I think that we all need to, it's not just Europe, I think all of us need to wake up to the reality. There are things which are not going to be in our control. or at least less control, and therefore we ought to be more collaborative in making sure that humanity is protected. Last words to you, but very briefly, if I may.
Thank you so much for you briefly.
Sorry.
And thanks a lot to our audience and the speakers. The consequences is I have not so many times in it. I try to give some conclusions indeed by responding to the ladies' comments on 3 points, right? Firstly, I think that according to Chinese understanding, this time on the EVs or some other, perhaps more frications or anti-subsidies, anti-dumping or some other, it's a kind of protection action without protectionism, right? I think that, yes, recent years, European Union side is always trying to, redefine its discourse on this protectionism or free trade or some other. But frankly speaking, I think now it's time for both China and Europe. We try to collect our efforts to reform or to insist reform the WTO and to find out maybe a new type or higher level multilateral arrangement for the free trade. So I think it will give, once something happens that way, I think it will help us to save up so much time. And we should collect our resources to do something more for more contribution to the multilateral trade arrangement. Secondly, about the CAI, I do have some of my own experience, especially during the final time of the signature and negotiation several years ago. Frankly speaking, even shortly before the signature by Chinese government on this CAI, Chinese side has some hesitant about it. Two major considerations. One of them is how could it deal with relations between us. At that time, there were 2 negotiations. One is between China and the European Union, another between China and the United States. China at that time felt a little bit hesitant that it should have the signature or agreement with the European Union firstly or with the United States firstly. Finally, as we know that China decided that, okay, we should have the agreement with the European Union firstly. I think it shows always the importance of China to take in the relations with the European Union as economic partners. Another, I think, hesitant for China is how big, precious, once we have the CAI with the European Union. I do have a very, very frank discussion with then European Union ambassador to China, a very nice French gentleman. He told me that, frankly, European Union will gain a lot of benefits from the CAI because market access, almost every area of market in China will open fully to European investment and the companies. But of course, for Chinese side, we are also get some benefits because we can try to find out more, sustainable factors to support our opening up and reform policy. And indeed, we can help the regional countries or the international community believe that China would be, the pioneer, China would be the leading role to support free trade and some other. But it's a really pity we missed the opportunities. But now I think it's time for us not miss another opportunity. Once we try to have some, more common benefits, I think now it's time for us to, firstly, to change the mind course or the mindset. Once we find that the essence of trade is everything but not human rights, not security, I think we will have a good job, we will have a good deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've run out of time, I'm afraid. And obviously, we are inviting you to stay for lunch, so you can have a conversation and discussion about what you think about what came out of today, both sessions. And I wanted to thank our contributors and yourselves for being here. I suppose, have we answered the question of can we take forward the practical measures for diplomacy over the next 50 years? Probably not. But have we been able to uncover and poke at some of the key issues that we need to address if diplomacy is to survive between the EU and China? I think we have. And I think it behoves all parties, really, to be able to think long and hard about the realpolitik of our world, our societies, and what's about to happen to all of us. Let's not forget, there's a huge diaspora in Europe of Chinese communities who have been here for 50, 60, 70 years, who uphold local economies, whether we like it or not. You go to bits of France, you go to Spain, you go to London, elsewhere. There is a huge diaspora of Chinese people who've made Europe their home. Equally, if you go to Beijing, if those of you who've been, it's more like a party town in New York than you'd imagine anywhere else. And it's thoroughly modern, and Gucci, Prada, and Louis Vuitton are everywhere. So your perception of what China and Europe reflects each other, we need to be more mindful of that. Actually, there are people who actually view these relationships very differently and are engaging with these relationships very differently. And we have to be mindful of that. And I suppose my final point is really that climate change is not going to take any fools for granted. And it is borderless. And the pace of technological development, I think the formal governments are not really aware of what's happening underground by malign actors. And the pace of generative AI is going through the roof. And I think that we need to be mindful of that. So the thing that should bring us together are these twin challenges, but also impacts on our common societies and our human beings and our people and people across the world. So that ought to provide the basis for a diplomacy for the future, I hope. Thank you all very much for being here, and take care, and see you again very soon. And keep an eye on our website. Thank you. Sorry?